So we had an unprecedented winter storm that we did not recover from quickly. The demand then on both the customer facing technology as well as the operational facing technology just started to brown out, right? It was crushed under the weight of unprecedented activity that just started backing up. So taking the airline down to 1,500 daily flights allowed us to reset aircraft, recover technology, put the crews where they needed to be. And then we had to rebuild because we disrupted about 2 million people. Those people who were directly affected, we refunded tickets, hotels, rental car expenses. We had a customer who had to buy a car on Craigslist and we paid him for it. We had people who had cruises that were canceled. We made them whole. So we did an extraordinary customer reimbursement effort. The last estimate I knew about all in, including the things that we had to go buy and fix, was over $1.2 billion. So while we had recovered from Winter Storm Elliott, while we were improving the operational performance of the company, the financial performance continued to lag. And that was obviously showing up in a stock price that just wasn't moving. So we became attractive to, an activist investment community that just thought that they could demand some changes that would help create a better financial performance, which would then be reflected, obviously, in the company's stock price. So Elliott Investment Management let us know they had purchased a stake and that they would be getting involved in making some, demands on the company.
The road to leadership is never a straight line. On this podcast, I'm interviewing the world's most interesting leaders about their mountaintop moments, their stumbling blocks, and everything in between. This is Stumbling Blocks, how great leaders are made.
For the first time in its 50-year history, Southwest Airlines dropped its open seating policy this week and adopted assigned seating. My guest today, Linda Rutherford, was the Chief Administration Officer of Southwest up until recently, and she takes us behind the scenes into the strategy that led to that policy change. Linda will talk about what it took to guide Southwest through two storms by the name of Elliott. First, Winter Storm Elliott, Southwest's operational meltdown in December 2022 that caused more than 17,000 flight cancellations and stranded more than 2 million Southwest passengers. And second, the way that Southwest executive team has navigated its relationship with activist investors, Elliott Investment Management, and all the changes they have driven after acquiring more than 10% of Southwest's stock, including the change to the open seating policy. Take a listen. Here's Linda Rutherford, former Chief Administration Officer of Southwest Airlines. In prep for this conversation, Linda, I was talking to your former Chief of Staff, and I want to just read something that she wrote that I thought was so interesting as your role shifted over time. She wrote, Linda served as the keeper of our corporate soul for a long time, bridging the founding generation of leaders, Herb and Colleen, to the modern. And so I wonder if you can talk about your role there, how you bridged the gap and served as the keeper of the soul of Southwest, which is a company known for having soul. Hell, it's got hearts on the bottom of every plane, at the front of every plane, and its Wall Street ticker is love. Yeah. So how did you do it? How did you keep the soul of an airline through, as you said, 4 CEO transitions?
Well, first, I would say she's very kind to call it that. I would think, first of all, this was not a sole effort. This is the effort of many people who wanted to ensure that even as we were dealing with some, really tough issues, call it the last, 10, 15 years, that we did it in a way that preserved our culture, because it had become such an important part of how we're defined, right? As a brand and as a company. We're known for getting involved in the communities that we serve. We're still one of the only airlines that actually actively practices philanthropy in terms of, awarding cash scholarships to students and awarding, airline tickets to charities that can use those in their business. And it's those kinds of things that just continue to set us apart. It is celebrating and taking care of, our people. And I think that, in my role as it grew over time, certainly as the Chief Communications Officer, to sort of, preserve that brand narrative as we were transitioning leaders, whether it was from Herb to Jim or Jim to Gary or Gary to Bob. It was making sure that, the leader was going to continue to be a good steward of that culture. Now, everybody had to do different things, right, to preserve the business, but making sure that the business understood that the culture was still a very important cornerstone of that, that overall narrative.
That the
I had
culture was a
responsibility
value
for
add.
that, certainly. Yeah, I had
The
responsibility
culture
certainly
added.
for that in the communications realm. And then as my responsibilities grew, I'd like to say that, I went from being a leader of function to a leader of leaders. And so I certainly was not the only keeper of the corporate soul, but I did feel the responsibility that the functions I was responsible for in hiring, right, in technology and tooling, AI, data transformation, in DE&I, in culture, in internal audit even, that I was responsible for making sure that those leaders continued to evolve their functions in service of Southwest Airlines and everything that meant, including our culture. So I saw it as my responsibility to make sure that those leaders were capable, that those functions continued to serve the organization as it was changing and evolving. A lot of people have referred to what's happening at Southwest Airlines right now as a transformation. I would actually say the airline is reinventing itself. There's just a lot of change, and certainly some of it came as a result of a nasty storm we had in the winter of the end of December of 2022, early 2023, and then subsequently with things that happened starting, I think, in the summer of 24 with Elliott Investment Management.
Right.
There have been changes to the company, but I would say that while those changes are being made, there's been great attention that continues to be paid to taking care of our people and making sure they still have outstanding benefits and negotiating, an unheard of number of labor contracts to ensure that our people were taken care of and that their pay and benefits packages continued to be top of industry. And then figure out a way to go afford that, of course. But I mean, there's still all that signal that the culture is alive, even in the way that we dealt with some of that adversity.
So let's get into the specifics of some of that adversity, because it's what you have survived over the last really 10 years-ish, or 8 years maybe, is nothing short of extraordinary. I was talking with someone on your team a couple of years ago, and it was right after COVID, but before Winter Storm Elliott. And she said, Jonathan, we're moving from an era of episodic crisis to just constant crisis. And that was before Winter Storm Elliott. So take us into Winter Storm Elliott, if you don't mind. It's Christmas of 2022. It started as a winter storm, and then it turned into something much bigger.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about it?
Yeah. So we had just done a very busy Thanksgiving. So the same schedule that we sold for Christmas, we operated for Thanksgiving. So there was no change to the flight activity. The difference was an extraordinary winter storm that we were not necessarily prepared to recover from quickly. And so what happened was, maybe the 22nd, 23rd of December, the Winter Storm Elliott is just starting to sweep across, the contiguous 48 states and hit a number of our large operations like Denver, like Chicago, like, Nashville, like BWI. So literally sweep across the country. And I think our greatest challenge was coming back from that, whether we were not able to recover aircraft and crews like we should have. So in other words, you might have a couple of days of bad weather, but basically you wake up and you've got your aircraft and your crews matched up. We did not. So quite frankly, trying to continue to operate through that weather meant that we had airplanes going one direction and sometimes crews going another, and we couldn't get them matched back up. So as the weather continued to move across the country, it was a problem that was literally snowballing for us, where we were getting aircraft and crews mismatched to the point where we had nearly ground to a halt. That ended up affecting about 2 million travelers. So it was
And two
you know,
thirds of your flights, right? Ultimately, you canceled 2/3 of your flights for a couple of
so
days.
what happened was, to recover the airline, we actually ended up canceling all but 1,500. We normally do it was between 48 and 5,000 flights a day during the peak holiday period. We took that down for a period of 4 or 5 days to just 1,500 flights a day. So we canceled a whole bunch of flights. Not only had we canceled it because of the weather, but then you had the follow-on where we canceled it. And that was simply to reroute aircraft and crews to get them back into the system where they needed to be. So we had an unprecedented winter storm that we did not recover from quickly. The demand then on both the customer facing technology as well as the operational facing technology just started to brown out, right? It was crushed under the weight of, unprecedented activity that just started backing up. And so then we ended up with technology, failures because we had systems that were simply not keeping up with the operation. So taking the airline down to 1,500 daily flights allowed us to reset aircraft, recover technology, put the crews where they needed to be. And on that Friday, I think it was maybe New Year's Eve, December 31st, we were able to operate a full schedule and recover the airline. So all during that time, we had, I like to say it was, we had to respond, and we had to recover, and then we had to rebuild. And so we had to respond to the immediate issues that were happening because every single city wanted to know how their, flight schedule was being impacted, how many people were being displaced because of delays and cancellations. Then we had to, recover the airline and explain what that process was going to look like. And then we had to rebuild because, again, we disrupted about 2 million people, not to mention our own employees who were, highly inconvenienced because they were scattered about the system. The communication to them, wasn't working the way that we wanted it to. And it took a while to kind of, again, rebuild and reset that.
And I would imagine for those who are customer facing, they were a little battered and bruised. 2 million angry people is no small thing to engage
because
on Christmas.
They didn't have good answers, and it was just a constant. It was like, when is this going to get fixed? And so, it was a big mess. Honestly, we get the airline reset. You've got the government involved at the time. Our transportation secretary, Pete Buttigieg, was sort of making, public statements about holding Southwest accountable. So now we have the government involved in wanting to know, what happened and how are we going to make it right.
So take us kind of into the war room. I would imagine sort of holed up in a war room with the CEO.
Again, we're immediately trying to respond to the immediate, questions around delays and cancellations. We're trying to explain what the recovery effort's going to look like, taking the airline down to 1,500 flights. It's going to be for 3 or 4 days. On that Friday, we were able to sort of announce we were operating, back to a full schedule, and then immediately went into the post-mortem of what happened. Like, do we understand what actually happened? How would we prevent it from happening again? How are we going to make things right with our customers, and how are we going to make things right with our employees? And so we did a number of things. We launched
what did you guys do?
We launched a website that basically said, we're going to go do, we know that there will be a review. So the board of directors had hired, counsel to kind of look at, what had happened. We wanted another outside consultancy to kind of come alongside and, compare notes around, what could we have done differently? Did we have different equipment needs? So we did a number of things. A whole set of learnings came out. We published them on a website. So we were very transparent with all of our audiences, customers, employees, regulators. We said, here's what went wrong.
Which is interesting to think back to what you said earlier about vulnerability, that vulnerability earns trust.
We knew the only way to rebuild trust was to obviously admit that this was a horrible situation and show the steps we were going to take to learn about what happened, and then what steps we were going to take to do everything in our power to make sure it didn't happen again. So transparently published a website, held ourselves accountable where we were making check marks every time we did what we said we were going to do. There were a number of things. We had 2 different systems as an example in technology, one that routed aircraft or rerouted aircraft, and one that routed or rerouted crew. They didn't necessarily talk to one another, but obviously you can think about it in a massive storm like what happened to us in Elliott. we were making solutions over here for aircraft and making solutions over here for crew that weren't necessarily synced up.
My
So we
goodness.
created a technology platform in, I think, around 9 months that brought those systems together so that we could make synchronized decisions around how to reroute aircraft and crews so that you didn't get things out of sync again. So that's an example. And then we published it. We didn't have an ample number of engine caps to help protect engines from ice and snow when they sat overnight. We made sure that we built that inventory. We got engine heaters, which are basically like these big turbo, massive heaters in order to keep aircraft warm enough as they sat overnight. We boosted our aircraft de-icing crews to make sure that we had enough resources during winter ops to be able to go, take care of that without getting aircraft, severely delayed. So all of those things, we held ourselves accountable to the public through that website and published it. And
do you remember
we
how many items there were on the website? How many operational changes you made that were both public and then sort of behind the scenes?
I don't remember exactly, but there were 9 to a dozen. There were 9 to a dozen different ones, and every time that we accomplished it, we kind of moved from in progress to a green check mark. And every quarter during our earnings interviews and our earnings call with analysts and news media, we spoke to the progress. And if we were adding a new check mark, we talked about what we had done and why we felt we'd accomplished it. Our COO went and gave testimony before a Senate subcommittee to explain, what we knew about what had happened and what we were going to do to prevent it happening again. And again, we gave our affected customers rapid rewards points to say we're sorry. Those people who were directly affected, we refunded tickets, hotels, rental car expenses. We had a customer who had to buy a car on Craigslist and we paid him for it. We had people who had cruises that were canceled. We made them whole. So we did an extraordinary customer reimbursement effort and then turned around and gave our employees through a program we have called SWAG, which is Southwest Airlines Gratitude. Our employees can collect points to kind of trade for merchandise and gift cards. And we went and gave every employee a gift from our CEO of points into their accounts that just as a way to say thank you, whether you had this kind of a role or this kind of a role, in helping the airline recover and rebuild. We wanted to say thank you and show our gratitude.
Do you remember the write down or the cost of those programs, the cost of the reimbursement programs for customers and
the last estimate I knew about all in, including the things that we had to go buy and fix, was over $1.2 billion to recover from that incident. The whole time we were monitoring, media sentiment, we were monitoring customer NPS scores.
Sure.
Interestingly, during that really bad week, we saw our scores dip to single digits. So we might normally see an NPS score of, call it 65 to 68.
Sure.
We dipped down to 9. But what was interesting was we never went into the negative. And we feel like those deposits that we had put in the Goodwill Bank over time, that people knew that Southwest would admit what was wrong culturally, tell you what we were going to do to make it right, and then actually follow through on that promise. And we did that. And so we saw a recovery within about 6 to 8 months of those NPS scores back to what I would call business as usual. And then we saw our reputational scores too. We tracked them through a system called RepTrack. So we saw our reputational scores also improve as people saw us taking steps to deliver on the promise.
It's remarkable. It's remarkable. $1.2 billion is a lot of money. Yeah. So I want to move on to the next Elliott, if I could. All the airline industry experiences COVID, and then Winter Storm Elliott, and then just about 18 months later, Elliott Investment Management. And so can you walk us through the airline's ongoing journey with Elliott Investment Management?
Sure. I mean, first of all, it's important to understand that in the middle of all of that, we had a CEO transition from Gary Kelly to Bob Jordan. And so, when Bob took over, he wanted to do an assessment of our business strategy to find out, what ways we needed to look at to modernize the airline. We needed to ask those tough questions. Is there anything that we're avoiding or not doing that we should be doing? We then had to deal with Winter Storm Elliott, under his watch. And so, again, all of the things that I just described that we did to kind of manage through that crisis of confidence and rebuild that trust was under his watch. And
It's
so
no easy thing for an incoming CEO. My
no
goodness.
easy thing for sure, but he'd had a number of years, decades working for the company. Also had sort of grown up within Southwest Airlines, so knew that we could manage that type of change and we could be resilient. I think we were in the process of evaluating all kinds of things, which is do we need to consider different classes of service? Do we need to consider different aircraft types? Do we need to think about assigned seating? Do we need to charge, for bags, which was something that I think as an executive team, that early analysis was, we really didn't want to do that because we felt like there was a value proposition that was sort of built into that being a customer expectation.
Yeah.
But our stock price was languishing. So while we had recovered from Winter Storm Elliott, while we were improving the operational performance of the company, the financial performance continued to lag. And that was obviously showing up in a stock price that just wasn't moving. So we became attractive to, an activist investment community that just thought that they could demand some changes that would help, create a better financial performance, which would then be reflected, obviously, in the company's stock price. So Elliott Investment Management let us know, I think it was in June of 24, that they had, purchased a stake and that they would be getting involved in making some, demands on the company. And it was, a strategic review, a refresh of the board. They did not like that we had an executive chairman. So that is the role that then CEO Gary Kelly had moved into when Bob Jordan became CEO. And they wanted to sort of insist that the board look at potentially replacing the CEO. And so there was several months of, demands made by Elliott, and, the company, trying to absorb what changes that it knew it wanted to make. I mean, a lot of these strategic reviews were already happening, but certainly, I think we're sped up, as part of this whole process. So ultimately, we arrived at an agreement with Elliott Investment Management, which discontinued the executive chairman role and created a lead independent director as the board chair. It initiated an accelerated review of our entire business strategy, and it brought a number of Elliott appointed board members onto the board. So of course now the board is getting reconstituted, and they're learning how to act as a new board, and just really driving a lot of interesting conversations around things that we need to be willing to do differently in order to stay competitive to what customers are insisting they want out of the travel experience, and certainly what the investment community is insisting that they want to see out of the financial performance of the company.
So Elliott quietly buys up a little bit more than 10% of the company, sends you guys a letter and says, hey, we now own 10% of the company. What was that moment like when you opened that envelope, if you will?
So I think, when we got the call, that the communication was made to obviously the executive chair, Gary Kelly, at the time. And, we very quickly assembled a small team of folks to understand what that meant. Quite frankly, having never had an activist investor in our stock before, I mean, we spent a good couple of weeks just getting up to speed and understanding, what did that mean? What are the rules? What does that mean? How can we engage this activist investor? How do we engage the rest of the investment community for them to understand, what we're doing in response to this activity? Do we have, quite frankly, internally, do we have all of the firepower that we needed? And we did it, right? So the legal department went and and staffed up with external resources to help there. The finance department went and staffed up with resources to help with people who were used to dealing with activist investors. The communications group went and staffed up with PR firms that would, had expertise in this area and could help advise us. So it was a lot of going to school really quickly because I guess thankfully or fortunately, there wasn't a lot of internal experience because it had never happened at Southwest before. And we hadn't necessarily brought anybody into the company who had previously dealt with that type of, activist investment activity. And so it was a lot of learning and asking questions very early on, and then understanding what our options were to arrive at, an agreement with them. And then adapting to those changes. Obviously, Gary came off the board. New board members joined. Other board members, who'd been with the company a long time left. And so there was a board transition that we had to manage. And then sort of understanding, the new dynamic. How should management work with this newly constituted board, and sort of establishing, that cadence and what did they expect of us, and was it, how was that different, and then adapting to that.
How have you done that? How have you adapted?
You have to develop a rapport, right? I mean, I talked about these trust relationships. We had to go develop relationships with these new board members and understand, their motivations. Like, what did they want to see happen? What did they know about our function? We spent some really intentional time, each of us as C-suite executives, onboarding these new board members and teaching them about these are my responsibilities, right? So when I have technology and internal audit and culture and communications and HR, here's what I'm trying to do right now. Here's areas that I think are where we're excelling. Here are areas that have my attention right now, where we're working on things, and then kind of hear from their perspective, like what do they see, about my functions, and where would they have me focused, and was that any different than the direction that we were getting from the previous board, and then adapting to that. I would say we changed up some of our, board presentations to sort of meet the vibe of this new board, and, started bringing things in that they wanted to hear more about, and being responsive to that. So, ultimately Southwest has made several different business decisions that, we started charging for bags at the end of May 2025. The execution of that, first of all, the technology development of that happened faster than any technology project I've ever seen. Secondly, the implementation of that was flawless. We didn't have any tech issues. We didn't have anything that, didn't work or fell apart. And so that went really, really well. And what we're getting ready to announce, or what will be announced at the end of January 2026, is operating in an assigned seating environment. And so
tell us about that.
History, we're assigning seats for anybody who's traveling January 27th or later. We have retrofitted our aircraft fleet to allow for premium seats, still all coach right now, but premium seats, extra leg room, and a changed philosophy, still taking care of the customer, but now trying to meet those customer needs for those who want to pay for those extra services, right? You're going to get, an upgraded travel experience from Southwest that wasn't previously available.
So truly a reinvention. And so my last question for you here is, the company is reinventing itself, as you said, adding in premium seats, adding assigned seating, paying for bags, these changes. And at the same time, some things are not changing, like you've just articulated as well, in terms of culture and the way that you treat your employees and the way that you treat your customers. And so I wonder, as we wrap up, Linda, if you could just sort of speak to a listener maybe who is a leader who is leading reinvention or big transformation in their company, just as you have led at Southwest. What one piece of advice would you give them as they lead reinvention?
I think the most important thing that an executive can think about if you are managing, a transformation, a disruptive reinvention, is the nitty-gritty elements of change management. I think 10 or 15 years ago, we all looked at change management as a memo or an all-hands meeting, and that you could then go check the box and say, I've done change management. And I think in this day and age, it is much more complex. It is understanding the psyche of your employees. It is making sure that through disruptive change, you still have a psychological safety for the employees to do their work. It is understanding that with everything we've all been through, sometimes the mental health of your employees are in a different place than might have been 10 years ago. And so understanding all of that means that we as executives really have to consider change management to ensure that this big transformation or this reinvention or this disruptive change that we're bringing into our organization sticks. And writing a memo and doing it all hands is not going to cut it. And so it is truly understanding what do employees need to absorb about this transformation change? Have I thought about the training and the upskilling that needs to happen? And am I allowing ample time for that? Am I introducing change in a way that can be absorbed by the organization? Have I given them the why? That's where communications can come in and be a good partner. Am I providing them resources to help them get from this change that has to happen to the transformation that has occurred? And now, maybe we're operating differently. Maybe we're doing different things. Maybe we're selling different products, and really being thoughtful about what that change management strategy should look like. In addition, not as a bolt-on, but in addition and as an integral part of an overall transformation strategy.
That's extraordinary. Thank you, Linda. I appreciate it so much. I'm so grateful for your time today, Linda. You are an inspiration to me and have been for many years, and I'm grateful for your time. Thank you.
Well, it is a mutual admiration society, Jonathan. So grateful for you.
As Southwest reinvents itself, I'm curious to see how the airline will change over time. If you have flown under the new assigned seating policy, shoot me an email at Jonathan@Block Leadership Group to tell me what your experience was like. Next week, I'm going to be joined by Brent Bayshore, CEO of a private equity company called Permanent Equity. It operates unlike any private equity firm I have ever encountered. And Brent's leadership as CEO is radically different from most. You don't want to miss what changed him deeply at age 27 and what he has done about it. I'll catch you next week on The Stumble.